92.1 WROI, WROIFM.com. We're streaming audio live, RTC Channel 5, and soon to be audio and video on RTC Channel 4. Elizabeth Sear from RTC, good morning.
Good morning.
Thanks for coming back.
Yeah.
I thought maybe we scared you away last week, but here you are.
Nope.
Okay, welcome back. Doc Talk Radio, brought to you by Woodlawn Hospital this morning. And again, we say good morning to Dr. Seward, Dr. Eric Seward. He is OBGYN at Woodlawn Hospital. Good morning. Good morning. I know also you are a runner of sorts.
This is true.
You run quite a bit? Okay.
And I've got a whole family of runners. So,
all right.
Yeah.
Well, that's why I wanted to ask you about this recent injury to Indiana Pacers Victor Oladipo, the ruptured quad tendon, and what that might involve, and rehab looks like it's going to take a while.
Well, first of all, the quads are the muscles, a big muscle group, and because there's 4 separate muscles involved, they're called quads, and they're the big muscle group that run down the front of the thigh. And one of the bigger muscle groups in the body, probably as opposed to the core muscles that hold up the spine, the psoas muscle group, which is probably the largest. That's probably the second largest group, and it's involved in a lot of the movement of the leg. It's especially involved in sort of power movement forward. And there's a very complicated. One of the more fascinating things is to look at a skeleton. And I think when you look at a skeleton, with the untrained eye, you just see some Halloween prop. But when you look really close at any bone on the body, you'll see that there are little grooves and there are little ridges and bumps and lumps. And every one of those things, coming from a guy who went through med school, every one of those things has a complicated name, usually derived from Greek.
that long.
And they're all the areas where it's sort of the framework where muscles attach. And so in the case of the pelvis, there are a lot of interesting little interactions that go on there. And if you think about it, most people can lay on their back, do a leg lift, rotate their leg in a pretty smooth circle. And in order to do that, you have to have a whole lot of different muscle groups engaged at different times in different ways. And so the quads are going to connect from basically the pelvis down to about the knee. And most of them kind of attach right into the kneecap. Now, I don't know any of the specifics about Oladipo,
exactly.
But as we were talking, I've been a fan of his since he played at IU.
Right.
And one of the things that I know about him is that guy can change directions probably better than anybody I've ever known. He can go, and he gets the most, and I think he's just one of those that can stretch and get the most out of what he's got. But that's running a razor's edge as to what your body's capable of doing. And if that quad muscle ruptures, either that means that it's rupturing at the level of either the tendons or things that connect muscles to bones. And so it's either connecting one of the connections at the pelvis into the quads or at the kneecap into the quads. You can also rupture muscles sort of mid rupture, or rupture the capsule of a muscle. And all of those things, depending, if it was a clean tear, it might require surgery.
I think they have said that surgery would be required in this instance. Yeah,
that's in that case. Then then he's got to go through that whole rehab process. If it's a partial tear, then a lot of times the body may heal itself. But either way, it requires immobilizing that muscle, and it's hard to immobilize your leg when you're a basketball player. It takes a long time. I think last year he was the number 1 point guy, and just the spark plug of the team. Right. I think he's still kind of a spark plug and maybe the moral compass of the team. But the Pacers, he doesn't seem to have been the biggest scorer this year as he was last year, and they seem to be a better team this year. So probably that's a good thing. But it's a tough loss for a team that's really been playing well.
Well, whenever you use that word ruptured, that's kind of a significant word in terms of the knee or wherever that tendon happened to be, because that could mean 8 months, a year, perhaps, of rehab, or once the surge's over. It's going to be a while.
I would refer to my colleagues, Dr. Rombeck and Dr. Sheedy, the orthopeds, for that. But I would say that is definitely a long. Any kind of injury like that, and especially when you're trying to get back to the high caliber play that he plays at. I think, a couple of years ago, different orthopedic injury altogether, but Paul George broke his
terrible injury.
His lower leg.
Terrible injury.
And, and I think most people kind of looked at that and thought, boy, wonder if he'll ever get back. That fella from Louisville a few years ago did a similar thing.
Right.
And those happen because of, in his case, it happened because there was microfractures. And again, these are just their stress fractures from overuse, and we see this in running a lot, but in their case it's from it's just that constant pounding.
Paul George is back better than ever, basically.
And he did come back. He did come back after a rough injury, and I think that I think everybody's hopeful that Oladipo will.
Everybody kind of wondering what it is about Indianapolis, where the stars like Peyton Manning going down with neck injury, and then, of course, Paul George, and then Andrew Luck going out for a season. And now we got Victor Oladipo. What's going on in Indianapolis?
I think when you're an athlete and you're working at that level,
sure.
I mean, it's just a razor's edge. And football, and I play sports in high school. I played football, basketball, and baseball. That was the big three. And I think back over the years, I took a baseball to the chops once, but that was probably the worst single injury I ever had in any sport. But I think if you look at the three, I remember getting trampled in football a couple times pretty good and seeing scars. But I think of all three of those sports, I mean, you kind of think football's dangerous, but I think I have more constant injuries playing basketball. And I mean, there isn't a finger on my hand, including thumbs, that wasn't constantly jammed, or I had a dislocated pinky once. I constantly had twisted ankles. You jump, you land on somebody's foot, and down you go. And I was a mediocre basketball player at that level.
We always think we're good, but it turns out that we're not quite as good as we think we are.
In sort of a general sense, but I was on a state championship basketball team.
Well, there you go.
That I wasn't good enough to make the varsity. So that said, that was the intensity of which you're playing. Ultimately determines how much these injuries are going to affect you. And I think, it's sadly, I think we as fans, or maybe fantasy football fans or whatever, we look at these big athletes and we think, the team is really based on, one or two guys. And in some cases, I think with Peyton Manning, I argued sort of jokingly that the year Peyton Manning didn't play, he should have been most valuable player, because if there was ever proof positive that one guy made a bigger difference for a football team,
absolutely,
in the NFL, I don't know that there's a good example of that. I think if Tom, there was a good example. Tom Brady went down
for a whole year,
a few years ago, and the B player jumped up, and they still had a winning season. But the Colts were basically dead on arrival without Manning, and it was just kind of an interesting thing.
Dr. Eric Seward is our guest, OBGYN at Woodlawn Hospital. That's not kind of what we came in to talk about today, is it?
Well, you're kind of out
in
of
the scheme of things.
I think it's kind of interesting that I just spent the weekend skiing.
Very good.
And was up in northern Michigan skiing, and that was a lot of fun. And I always think all of the different potential things that can come up when you're skiing. My mom would say, watch out for trees, and and I'm always thinking about shins and knees and things like that. But kind of an interesting subpoint while we're on the orthopedic kick. My daughter goes to school out in Colorado, and I was in this little town that's probably no bigger than, actually it's quite a bit smaller than Rochester, probably half the size maybe, and up the road there's a little town called Crested Butte, which is probably a quarter of the size of its little ski town. In between those two places, they have something like 9 orthopedic surgeons. and it kind of stood out to me. Maybe I'm sensitive to this, but I'm driving down the road going, there's an orthopedic office, there's an orthopedic, wow, there's another orthopedic office. And I think it is kind of, it's one of those, it's a big business part of every community's hospital.
Sure.
But when you get into these places where legs and joints and all of this, and the team physicians for teams like the Pacers or the Colts are going to include, if not prominently first and foremost, are going to include an orthopedic surgeon, because that's where almost all of these,
sure.
When you see, knee injuries and Achilles injuries, and in this case a ruptured quad, those things are going to happen. I think, and the other side would be in football. I think there's a huge, emphasis now on the neurological part of head injuries,
concussion protocol,
concussions, and all that, which affects how.
But they say more concussions actually happen when you're playing soccer than they do when you're playing football.
Yeah, well, that's true, and it's kind of interactive. I coached soccer for years,
sure.
And there was a grand debate about when do you teach using your head in soccer. And one school of thought was, well, you want kids to learn how to do it right, and you want to learn early, because otherwise they're just sticking their head out in the line of fire. But there's also this sort of notion that the younger the kid is and the more head trauma you take as a younger child, that it probably does more damage. And I think my opinion on this is sports are dangerous, and they're good for you and they're bad for you, and you have to accept the risk of that when you take it on. I do think it's concerning, when I think about my own children and would I want them out playing full contact football, or would I rather them running cross country? Well, my kids chose cross country, but
sure.
but my youngest might, he seems to have an affinity to football, and he may choose that, or he may choose soccer or something like that. And you kind of have to do what you can to keep him safe, but at some point you gotta say this is what the sport is.
Part of life.
It is, yeah. And I played football and I played basketball, and I know you can hurt yourself, and I still would have done it the same way again.
Exactly. I
might not have jumped off the barn roof that one time. That hurt.
No, that probably is.
But that's a whole different story.
Kind of a poor call that time, yeah. Right.
Yeah. Well, what I was going to talk about today, you brought that up, was I was going to kind of get into a pregnancy talk, and I think the first part of that we could probably cover, and we'll start with pregnancy tests. I see this all the time. People come into the office and they are excited. I think the minute you pee on the old stick and it says you're pregnant, that's an exciting moment in anybody's life. It's also a cautionary moment, because as it turns out, our modern pregnancy tests are pretty darn good. They'll pick up just a little bit of pregnancy.
Pretty reliable.
And the ones that you buy at Walgreens or CVS or Walmart are really basically the same thing that we have in the doctor's office. They're essentially you pee on a thing. The only problem you may run into is with timing, and I'll get into that here in a second, or with your interpretation of it. I mean, sometimes is that line showing up or not, is sort of in play. But what's funny is people come in all the time and they're like, well, I'm pregnant. I took 4 pregnancy tests and they were all positive. And I'm here to tell you that you just need to take one. If it's positive, it's positive. You don't need to take the second,
get
third,
that second
and fourth.
opinion.
Yeah, it's not going to, there's a thing that we kind of roll with. It's called sensitivity and specificity. And sensitivity is the number of positives that are truly positive. And with pregnancy tests, it's a very high sensitivity. So when somebody there aren't very many false positives in the world of pregnancy. Now, that doesn't mean the pregnancy is normal. And in fact, one of the cautionary part of this is when you take a pregnancy test and it's positive, and then you go straight to Facebook and tell everybody it's positive, there's about a 50-50 chance that pregnancy is not going to stick. That's just so early. We're catching these things really about the time of a missed period. And, kind of going through the physiology of that, what we're testing with a pregnancy test is something called HCG, human chorionic gonadotropin. It's the pregnancy hormone.
Okay.
And if you sort of think about what's happening, in a normal, we'll just assume an average 28-day cycle, somewhere right around day 14, and we start our counting the first day of the period. you're going to have an egg ovulate. And it's going to go out and it's going to set in the ampulla of the fallopian tube, the little kind of widened out area with little fingers on the end of the fallopian tube. And it's going to kind of hang out there for about 24 hours. If it meets a sperm and they do the dance and everything goes perfectly, you'll end up with a fertilized egg. That fertilized egg is not going to give you a positive pregnancy test yet because it's not attached to anything. It's just floating in space. But it starts to divide and divide and divide, and it goes through several embryonic phases, a morula, a blastula, and then by the time it gets to the uterus, it's what we call a blastocyst, meaning the cells have divided enough that they are starting to involute and specialize a little bit. When they hit the lining of the uterus, they make contact within hours to a day or so with the maternal circulation, and at that point, that's the first point that you're going to see an HCG level rise up to make a positive test. But again, you're talking about a ball of cells that really doesn't necessarily even have a baby in it yet. It's just a sperm and an egg found each other in some form or another.
Okay.
They come down, they've landed, and they've given you enough information to say that that's happened. Basically, from that point forward, a whole bunch of embryonic things development have to happen, and you have to have just the right genetics. Almost all miscarriages are due to some problem with the genetics. It's usually a situational problem, not a heritable problem. So when I say it's a genetic problem, there's sort of two forms of that. If you say my mom had blue eyes, therefore I'm going to have blue eyes, well, that's a heritable genetics. But if I have two sperm that get into one egg, now I've got a whole extra set of chromosomes. That's a triploidy, meaning you just got too much, and too much of a good thing isn't a good thing in this case. That's a pregnancy that's never going to take off and fly. It's got a genetic basis for that. It's going to give you a positive pregnancy test maybe, but it's not going to take off and fly. And that's one example that's easy to understand, but there are about a zillion different ways that you can miss or have an extra or a partial chromosome, or maybe even a single gene that won't allow that to go on and develop. And that makes up most of the miscarriages that people have. So when people come into the office at 6 weeks, for me, and we've got this positive pregnancy test, a lot of times I'll do an ultrasound at that point to try to determine, are we dealing with a viable pregnancy? And that's one of the 4 or 5 things I'm trying to get out of that. But the positive, once you see a heartbeat, once you see an embryo forming, you see a little thing called a yolk sac, which, just like it sounds, in an egg, a chicken egg, you've got a yolk. Well, mammals, people don't have to have a yolk because we don't necessarily have to survive our entire embryonic life in a shell.
Sure.
But we do have to. There's sort of a remnant component to our sort of developmental evolution that has a little bit of the survival yolk in there, and you can see this early in ultrasounds. That disappears by usually 8 weeks or so, 7-8 weeks. But once you see that heartbeat, once you see that things are sort of progressing on the schedule that you think, that miscarriage rate drops from about 50-50 down to 4% or less. And so that's the first big, yes, I think we're on the right track. I always encourage people when they ask me not to put it on not to take out the billboard or call great grandma or put it on Facebook until they see that heartbeat. And then at that point, it sometimes is still a cautionary go for it.
And how far into it is that?
Usually I can see a heartbeat around 6 weeks.
Okay.
So it's you had your last period, you ovulated around 2 weeks, you had a positive pregnancy test around 4 weeks, 2 weeks after that, I can see that. And backing up to the pregnancy test, there are two kinds of pregnancy tests. What I just was talking about are what are called qualitative tests, meaning they just give you a yes or a no. You pee on a stick, you get 2 lines or a positive or whatever kind of test you have. there's also a thing called a quantitative test, and this is another thing that we oftentimes do in the office to try to differentiate where we are with something. Somebody comes in, they think they're 6 weeks. We look, and I see maybe a gestational sac, but I'm not able to make out all of the little components of it, not see a heartbeat yet. You can do these quantitative HCGs to sort of see, are we going up at the rate that we would expect to go up? Turns out a positive quantitative test starts at around 5 to 10 depending on the lab, and it doubles about every 2 days, and so it'll go from 10 to 20 to 40 to 80 and so forth and so on, and it peaks out at something like 120,000 maybe. I like to, I use the comparison, the first positive is like a Big Mac compared to a house. It's in terms of dollars and cents.
Sure.
So there a lot happens, and you can see that progression, and that's a really good tool when we're trying to decide whether a pregnancy is moving the right direction, or if somebody has a miscarriage and we're trying to see is it moving out, is it clearing out, or do we need to go in and do something about it? And so, that's one of the tools that we sometimes use early on to establish pregnancy. And usually by 6-7 weeks, I have a very clear picture of where I think things are going to go. There are other variables that sometimes show up later. And I can't look at a lima bean with a heartbeat on an ultrasound and say, this kid's destined to go to Harvard, but I can say that most of the time I can say that this looks good, this looks normal. And as you see the progress, if you went back to just when I was a kid, or even later, probably into the early 1980s, commercial pregnancy tests weren't as available and they weren't as accurate, and so people weren't relying on them as much, and we were diagnosing pregnancy a lot later, so miscarriage rates were actually lower because, if people were 2 weeks late or 3 weeks late on a period, they just assumed they were 2 or 3 weeks late on a period. And that's how it went for centuries before. Nowadays, we are super hypersensitive. Most of my patients know right away. Once in a blue moon, we'll get somebody that's like, I'm what? Say what? But most of the time, it's discovered pretty early. We try to aim to get people into the office 7, 8, 9 weeks to try to confirm things. And my ultrasound is really good for confirming that heartbeat, but also we want to make sure there's just one in there. We want to make sure that there's. I have a really funny story about that. I've had a number of times over the years where I did an ultrasound and found twins, which is always fun, and usually you'll get, a mom that'll say, shut up, or I got slapped in the shoulder once, or sometimes hysterical laughing. But I had this mom once who I saw 2 heartbeats. I said, oh, look, it's twins. And she very appropriately said, oh, well, do they both look okay? And I hear a thump. and I'm like, well, I look up, and the dad had just,
gone.
Woo, bonk.
I understand.
And she just kind of looked over and just kept talking to me. And I was like, oh, hold on a second. Make sure he's okay.
Revive your husband here.
But yeah, it's funny. Usually it's the other way around.
Can we continue this next month?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Let's do. And of course, people that might have some questions or might want to talk with you further, you're at Woodlawn Hospital. I
am at Woodlawn Hospital. I'm there just about every day. Be there in about 10 minutes from now.
All right.
So, yeah, no, anybody.
Call the hospital for an appointment?
Call the hospital for an appointment.
Okay.
Yep.
Dr. Eric Seward. Dr. Seward, is always a pleasure to talk with you. Thank you.